Hello everyone, and welcome to Penny University. If you're new here, I'm Melissa. Before we get started, go ahead and pour yourself a cup of coffee, pull up a chair, and let's talk history. On today's episode, we are talking about 5 historical coffee bans. Now, coffee has been with us for a very long time and has changed along with us. From being brewed straight to different brewing methods, there are now so many ways to drink it. In fact, it's hard to imagine life without seeing it around. There appears to be a Starbucks or gourmet coffee house around every corner, and there are so many colors and options. It has truly integrated itself into our everyday life. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, throughout much of the 15 to 1700s, coffee was seen as a means for the lower classes and masses to gather and talk. Many governments viewed this as a threat and, on several occasions, tried to ban its citizens from drinking it. Now, before we talk about historical attempts to ban coffee, let's first talk about its origins and how it spread around the world. Coffee's story begins in Ethiopia, and it isn't known when or how it was first brewed, but there is a legend behind it. It says that one day, a goat herder named Kaldi noticed his goats eating some local berries, after which the goats would be so energetic they wouldn't even sleep at night. Concerned about this, Kaldi mentioned it to his local abbot. The abbot picked some of the berries, made a brew, and drank it. He found he was also immediately energetic and found that the drink sustained him during his very long evening sermons. After seeing their abbot with so much energy, the other monks asked him about it. The abbot made them all cups of coffee. The monks loved it, and word of these stimulating berries began to spread. From Ethiopia, we then see the beans and berries spread to the nearby Arabian Peninsula, and soon coffee cultivation began, followed by a major trade in it. By the early 1500s, it was growing in the Yemeni district, and by the early 1600s, its effects were known throughout much of the Middle East. With an increase in cultivation and trade in Arabia, coffee houses began to pop up, and these were known as kave-ne, but they weren't just places to sit and enjoy a cup of coffee. Many would come, socialize, watch actors and musicians perform, discuss current events, and much more. And soon these coffee houses took on a new name, Schools of the Wise. At the same time, coffee also took on a new name and was known as the Wine of Araby. By the early 1600s, coffee had made its way throughout most of Europe and into England. And in England, the coffee houses were known as penny universities, with a cup of coffee costing 1 penny. Now, the same as in Arabia, people would come, gather, learn, and socialize. As coffee spread, it also began to replace the morning beverages of wine and beer, as drinkers found that it kept them awake throughout much of the day. Many employers even found that it helped to improve the work of their employees. And by 1750, there were as many as 300 coffee houses in London alone. When the Dutch settled in America, they brought coffee with them, and then when the English came, they brought tea, which was actually the most popular drink in the colonies until 1773 and the Boston Tea Party. But even by the 1700s, coffee's cultivation was still mainly in Arabia. The Dutch, now looking for new money avenues, got a hold of some seedlings and tried to grow them in India. It didn't work as well as they thought, but not deterred, they tried again in the nearby islands of Java, then in Sumatra and Celebes. And here the beans flourished, and we still grow coffee in these regions today. In 1723, a young French naval officer obtained a young plant from King Louis and took it with him to the island of Martinique in the Caribbean. Along the voyage, they encountered rough seas, encountered pirates, and even some tried to either steal or destroy this young tree. But it made it safely to the island, and here it truly flourished with a capital F. Over the next 50 years on the island, it's believed this one seedling gave way to over 18 million coffee trees. In fact, it's also believed this one seedling is the parent of all the coffee trees that now grow in the Caribbean as well as Central and South America. As the centuries wore on, coffee seedlings were carried to various places around the world. Some flourished, some died, fortunes were made, fortunes were lost, but nonetheless, countries began to rely on coffee as a major export. And to this day, coffee is the second most sought-after commodity in the world, second only to crude oil. Now that I've covered the general history of this delicious stimulant, let's now cover the 5 bans attempted on it. The first ban was in Mecca in 1511, and as I mentioned, many governments believed that coffee would inspire its citizens to gather and socialize, and believed that if this happened, there would be anti-government or radical ideas which would then spread throughout the country. Here, there was a local official named Kahir who saw some men drinking outside a coffee house one day and believed them to be acting suspiciously. It isn't certain on how he was able to create the ban, but we do know he used religious justifications for it. Along with the ban, anyone caught drinking coffee was beaten. The ban didn't last long, however, and was lifted in just a matter of weeks. Over time, Mecca had other attempts to ban coffee, all of them lifted in just a matter of weeks. For our second ban, we're traveling to England in the late 1600s, and here it wasn't so much the government's concern over the stimulant, but the Catholic Church. Catholic priests and clergy saw the drink as satanic and believed it would lead many to discuss anti-church ideals. They demanded that the Pope ban anyone from being able to drink it. They even called coffee the bitter invention of Satan. The attempt didn't work quite in the favor of the bishops and clergy, though, as when the matter was discussed with Pope Clement VIII, he decided he was going to taste this satanic drink first before deciding if he was going to ban it. Turns out, Clement liked the drink so much that he even made a passing remark that it should be baptized. And with this quote-unquote papal blessing, coffee was now saved from damnation, and coffee houses were once again on the rise throughout Europe. Next on our list, we see the Ottoman Empire attempting to ban this delicious beverage. And in 1623, ruler Murad IV took the throne and immediately put a ban on coffee throughout the entire empire. There were even punishments on what would happen if you were found to be drinking coffee. First offense, you would be beaten. Second and last offense, you would be sewn into a leather bag, tossed into the Bosphorus River, and left to drown. Legend also goes that Murad would prowl the streets of Istanbul in disguise, looking for anyone drinking coffee. And if he saw someone disobeying his law, he would confront them, draw out his broadsword, and reveal himself to the guilty party, and then decapitate them on the spot. After the Ottoman ban, we don't see another major attempt to outlaw coffee until 1746 in Sweden. Turns out that coffee had actually made its way to Sweden about 100 years before, but it wasn't widely enjoyed for some time. By 1746, it had become the preferred drink amongst the wealthy, thus creating a demand for it. King Gustav III decided he was going to issue a royal edict on coffee as well as on tea, stating that there was a, quote, misuse and excess drinking of tea and coffee. The king also outlawed the use of any coffee paraphernalia. Anyone caught drinking either of the beverages were made to pay very heavy taxes, and failure to pay the taxes saw the police coming into your home and confiscating all of your paraphernalia. In addition to the confiscation, anyone caught drinking coffee was also sentenced to death, which seems to be a theme here. This time, though, the punishment was a bit unusual. If you were sentenced to death for coffee consumption, your punishment would be to die via coffee consumption. You would be forced to drink cup after cup after cup of coffee while doctors watched on and determined how many cups it would take to kill you. This wouldn't be the only time Sweden tried to ban coffee. There was another attempt in 1794 and a handful of times in the 1800s. None of them stuck, and to this day, Sweden is actually one of the top coffee-consuming countries in the world. Last ban on our list today takes us to Prussia in 1777 and was actually instigated by Frederick III, also known as Frederick the Great. This time, though, it wasn't so much the government or ruler believing that consuming coffee would lead to impure or immoral thoughts or societal eruptions. This time, it would be a major feud between coffee and beer. During the late 1700s, Prussia's consumption of beer had begun to dwindle as coffee was on the rise, and Frederick believed that the beer was far superior to coffee, having been drinking it since he was young, and would actually drink a glass every morning with breakfast. As I mentioned, wine and beer were the preferred breakfast beverages until coffee came along. In order to counteract the coffee versus beer issue, he put out a royal decree encouraging his subjects to drink beer instead. And he's actually quoted as saying, "It is disgusting to notice the increase in the quantity of coffee used by my subjects and the amount of money that goes out of the country as a consequence. Everybody's using coffee. This must be prevented. My people must drink beer. His Majesty was brought up on beer, and so were both his ancestors and officers. Many battles have been fought and won by soldiers nourished on beer, and the king does not believe that coffee-drinking soldiers can be relied upon to endure hardships in case of another war." The ban, of course, was short-lived, and according to the book, The Introduction of Coffee to Germany by William Ukers in 1781, says that the king could no longer keep the people from enjoying a hot cup of coffee. Frederick still tried to keep coffee at bay, though, and decided that anyone wanting to make it needed to have a special license to roast it, or have it done at a royal roasting establishment. Many in the government, the clergy, and nobility could afford these licenses, and it made Frederick a lot of money. Anyone from the lower classes applying for a special license, though, were always strictly denied. In addition to requiring a license to roast and make coffee, Frederick also had people that were called coffee sniffers, or coffee smellers, who went around sniffing throughout the kingdom, looking for those who violated the king's law. These were often military veterans, and if the spies found anyone creating illegal coffee or consuming it, the accused would be arrested, and the sniffers would actually collect 25% of all the fines. Despite all of his attempts, though, coffee was ever popular, and much like many places around the world, you would find artists and intellectuals of the day frequenting the local coffee houses, many of them actually even addicted to it. No surprise there. Composer Johann Sebastian Bach was apparently so in love with coffee that he even wrote music about it, called the Coffee Cantata. And it's actually a one-act comedy operetta that satirizes both sides of this, quote, war on coffee. Now, before we go, let's look at some notable figures from history who were known to be massive coffee drinkers. And this comes to us from the blog Coffee Addicts Throughout History. First, we have Samuel Pepys. And if you don't know who he is, I really recommend looking him up, definitely checking out his diary. And it looks like the blog gives him 3 beans out of 5. And says he drank liters of coffee every day. My. And here we have Johann Sebastian Bach with 3 beans out of 5. If I can't drink my bowl of coffee 3 times daily, I will shrivel up like a piece of roasted goat. Which is actually a quote from the Coffee Cantata. And here we have Voltaire, one of my favorite people in history, with 5 out of 5 beans. Sounds about right. Consumed upwards of 40 cups a day, which sounds like Voltaire. Oh no, looks like he liked mochas. And here we have Beethoven, with 4 beans out of 5. I've actually known for a long time that Beethoven was very, very into coffee and also very, very meticulous about making his coffee. Well, we have Soren Kierkegaard with 4 beans out of 5. And it looked like he liked his sugar laced with coffee. But hey, if it gets you through the day, any which way works. Looks like that's going to do it for today's lesson. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe. I post new videos every Tuesday. If you have any suggestions, feel free to leave them for me in the comments below. Don't forget to check out my socials for even more history, and I'll see you all next week.